Hello, good afternoon from Washington, D.C. and welcome. I'm Colleen Parsons. I'm the Director of Global Irish Studies here at Georgetown University. It's my pleasure to welcome you here. First thing I want to do is thank some people, thank the English Department of the Georgetown Humanities Initiative for co-hosting. And the college, Georgetown College, was our College of Arts and Sciences, and Candace and Mary for helping us out with all of the technical work here. I'm delighted to be hosting actually our first sort of Georgetown driven event of the year. We've had a couple of co-hosted events, but this is the first one that's coming live to you from, in fact, from campus. I'm on campus, which is our first event in a year and a half that's actually happened. A couple of quick announcements, particularly for our Georgetown students who are on the line. And a reminder, we just advertised what we're calling Global Irish Studies Fellowships, which are opportunities for grad and undergraduate students to apply for research funding for independent research fellowships, or indeed to work on their thesis, whether senior thesis or MA thesis or PhD dissertation. So check out, I think Mary has just put a link in our in the chat to give you information about these fellowships. So please do check them out if you're interested in doing any kind of research related to Ireland, or even creative practice related to Ireland. These are available. I think the closing date is the 12th of November. Also, check on our website, globalirish.georgetown.edu, for upcoming events. Just to say, on November 8th, we'll be having a symposium on, we're wading into the idea of a symposium on Northern Ireland past, presents, and futures. These, for anybody who knows, these are pretty controversial words. And it will be a great conversation. That's on November 8th in association with American University and the Northern Ireland Bureau. And then in early December, on a date to be confirmed, we will hold the third in our annual Bridging the Atlantic policy discussions on Ireland, the US, and the European Union. So watch out for an announcement for that. That's it for announcements. So really, we can now get into the meat of it. It's my great pleasure to be hosting a few of my favorite colleagues and friends and writers, but particularly to be coming together to talk about I have it here actually, Nicholas Allen's book, Ireland, Literature and the Coast, Seatangled. But we're going to call it Seatangled because I think that's Nicholas's favorite title for it. It is a really beautiful, elegantly written and meticulously researched book. It's a significant intervention into the field of Irish literature and also of oceanic studies or blue humanities or hydrocolonialism or whatever we want to call this. It ranges widely across literature and visual arts of Ireland in the 20th century and offers readings of the liquid forms of Irish and British culture that uncover a new geography of Irish culture, one marked by sort of fugitive forms, by aqueous identities and dissolving borders. It's a definitive account of the ebb and flow of the sea in the Irish literary tradition over the last 120 years or so. The argument behind Seatangled is deceptively simple, that there is a relationship between water and form in Irish literature. But the potential yield of that is actually really enormous. It makes a sustained and compelling case for rethinking the ground of Irish literature in the 20th century, leaving land and territory behind and exploring the shifting sands of Ireland's oceanic contexts. It is, I think I mentioned this already, it is beautifully written, it is worth your while reading it, and it's our pleasure to come together today to talk about the book, but also to talk about the ideas in the book and to think about how it fits into a larger conversation about modernism form and contemporary writing and the ocean or the sea or the coast, all of these things together. To talk about this book, we have some very distinguished guests. I can find their bios here. I could probably just put these together without even looking for them. Very distinguished guests, and I'm delighted to welcome them all. You should be able to see them now on your screen. Nicholas Allen, writer of Seatangled, is endowed professor in the humanities and director of the Wilson Center, a really fantastic center for the humanities at the University of Georgia. He is the author of a great book on AE, George Russell and the New Ireland, and the author also of Modernism, Ireland and Civil War from Cambridge University Press. And this, his latest, is, of course, Ireland literature and the coast, Seatangled. And we're delighted to have you, Nicholas. And then to discuss the book and to be in conversation with Nicholas, we have Lucy Collins. Welcome, Lucy, who's coming to us from Dublin. She's Associate Professor of Modern Poetry at University College Dublin School of English, Drama and Film. And she has a particular interest in the work of Irish women writers, and her critical anthology, Poetry by Women in Ireland, 1870 to 1970. Was followed by a monograph then on contemporary Irish women poets, memory and estrangement. She's also co-edited The Irish Poet and the Natural World, a really lovely collection that I think will speak well to what we're talking about today. It's an anthology of verse in English from the Tudors to the Romantics. She has worked on the Irish Poetry Reading Archive, a national digital repository, and she's the academic lead on a Poetry as Commemoration project. So there's a lot going on, and we're delighted that you are joining us, Lucy. It's a real pleasure. Third, we have Harris Feinsod from Northwestern University, where he's Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literary Studies. He is a cultural historian of the Americas and the Atlantic world, and the author of a literary history entitled The Poetry of the Americas, From Good Neighbors to Countercultures. Most important today, of particular importance today, he is now at work on a book with a great title, which is Into Steam, The World of Maritime Modernism, which offers a global cultural history on the industrialized seaways of the early 20th century. And finally, I'm very excited to introduce our final guest here, who is my colleague and my friend, Nicole Rizzuto from Georgetown University, where she's Associate Professor of English, and her amazing first book, Insurgent Testimonies, Witnessing Colonial Trauma in Modern and Anglophone Literature, was shortlisted for the Modernist Studies Association Prize for a first book. And her second book that she's working on right now, again, very apropos, is tentatively entitled Arresting Ecologies, and it analyzes intercepted and thwarted and sort of paralyzed movement across land, air, and sea as a formal principle. So welcome to all of you. I'm delighted that you're here. This is going to be really fun. I don't know about all of you who are listening to us. We're planning to be here for the next 3 hours, but you don't have to stay longer than an hour. We've a lot to talk about. Nicholas, I might turn to you first just to give us a sense of an overview of the book, and maybe ask you to give us an idea of where the book came from, and what do you think the yield is of reading Irish literature from the sea or from the coast, which is really quite a new angle to take on this. So where did this all start and come from?
Well, thank you, Colleen, and thank you always for your friendship. And I suppose the first thing I was going to say, maybe that the book comes actually from a set of friendships which go back into Ireland, but are also of America. And Nicole and Lucy and Harris, thank you so much for coming along and doing me the honor of talking about the book today. As you know, writing these things can be a lonely business, and you often wonder afterwards into what shores they will fall. So I'm very grateful that you're here with me today to talk the book and talk about the larger field too, because it's been a real liberation for me, I must say, to think and spend time with my friends in the blue humanities and in coastal studies. And it started, I suppose, really whenever I was in Galway, and I used to trek out to see Tim Robinson in Roundstone. And, I didn't have any particular agenda when I did so, except it was the one place where I always felt a sense of freedom out there. And Tim and Maria were always so welcoming, and I used to meet such interesting people there. And I was always struck by the landscape very much. It reminded me a little bit of the north that I'd grown up in, but it was different too, and wilder. And that sense of the open Atlantic off there, of the weather. And I suppose that brought something back to me from earlier when I first came to America. And I remember teaching James Joyce's short story, The Dead. And a student asking me, does it snow a lot in Ireland? And I thought, well, goodness, no, it really doesn't. But why would that be a question? Why is it important to think about the weather of a text? And then later, having moved too far inland, mistakenly, I'm becoming slightly obsessive about missing the sea, about its rhythms, its smell, the ozone, that sense of time and space you have there, which is different, I think, from a more landed experience. All of those things came together for me. And I just, I really wanted to write a short book. I kept thinking, I only want to write a small thing about a small idea, which genuinely is that, what's it like to write about the experience of being by the sea? But of course, that then leads you into declensions of water, into variations in weather. and into different textual forms. And I didn't intend to write a history. And I don't think the book is a history, but I do think that it leads to other histories and versions of Ireland, of its literature, of islands and coasts, that might make us think about how the literature relates to the visual arts, how it relates to the sonic arts, how it relates to place. And since those things have always been relatively unsettled, even for me, and I've, I suppose what has happened with Brexit in the last couple of years has also made me think a little bit differently about the book too. But that long receding wave of modernity in the form of maritime empire, which is still so imprinted through the culture and society of the island of Ireland as a whole, it never seemed to me to have a language of description in the literature or the cultural experience. And in a way, I think what I tried to do in the book was to say that these imprints, that these pulses and passages, these currents, if that's not too many maritime metaphors, and I tried in the book to rein myself in, not to get too carried away with the vocabulary of fluidity, and to measure the book in some degree. But if you were to provide a language to describe those things which we have turned our eyes away from, then when we looked at them again, how would that change our sense of belonging and landedness? And I suppose someone surprised me, a friend who said, well, it's quite a provocative book. And I thought, well, goodness, I didn't try to write anything in any way provocative. I was just describing these books in these contexts. But actually, I do think that whenever we think about these liquid attachments and reading Nicole's work and in Harris's and Lucy's brilliant work, and we're going to come to Lucy in a minute, but about attachments with other beings and ourselves, other senses of perception, other connections, other cultures, and thinking about them not just through the metropole. I was really struck by some of the work that had been done, and this is thanks to you, Colleen, in South Africa, and thinking about hydrocoloniality, that those words made sense in Ireland in a way that they hadn't previously to me. In earlier forms of post-colonial conversation about Ireland, I really favoured the idea of the late imperial, because to me still there were forms of the national story or accounts of nationalism in the post-colonial account that perhaps didn't seem to represent some of the diversity of either my own experience or my own approach to the reading of literary texts. And so in that sense, I suppose having this sense of the oceanic, of the maritime, of the watery, it didn't in any way dilute the historical question or the aesthetic question, but rather made those things come together again in different waves of appreciation. And, I really think differently about the literary text now. I mean, there's John Sherman starts the book, the early Yeats book. But I think to me, really, that chapter that I added actually at the end of the book after I had written the first drafts about Elena Cullinan's poetry, I had always had a feeling for that work. I'd always tremendously admired it. And that really allowed me to write about that poetry in a way that I wouldn't have been able had I been using the models that I had inherited in some way. So I suppose it's a book of friendship, and I should say also it's a book of freedom. The last book that I had written, I won't say, it didn't feel true to me in a way after I had written it in a way that this book felt true to me. So I suppose one of the other things that I appreciate about this conversation, and it's kind of reassuring in a way, is that it's a book that feels kind of truly of myself. So it has these historical and it certainly has these theoretical. And I really tried in its citational practice to show the many generations of criticism led up to this kind of work, and to show also the many brilliant young and emerging scholars who are doing this work now and who do it in so many fascinating ways. But also that sense of network is not the old, perhaps Irish sense of network where you had to show where you'd come from in order to be accepted, that you had to say the right things at the right points, but rather to show that you yourself, as a living part of this conversation, could learn from and be part of a community of learning about this wider perspective, which involves ecology, the environment, the catastrophes it faces, but also these historical encumbrances that still, in the kind of north of Ireland that I grew up in, that seems so powerful. And maybe we'll pass to Lucy now. I know Lucy is going to speak next, but I just want to say I really find Lucy's work really liberating in a sense, because there's so much of the contemporary thinking about nature and poetry, especially in the Irish literary tradition, that's really helping us provide a new vocabulary and a new set of citational reference, a new set of openness in the text, even things that we thought were closed or lost altogether are really connecting in different ways now. So there's a whole new ecosystem that I hope the book is a part of, and certainly that Lucy's work has helped connect to, as is yours, Colleen, with your ideas of mapping and telescopy that I've followed for many years.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, and when you talk about a sort of a whole new world of ecological thinking, much of it that has less to do with a sort of a homage to land and an homage to territory and homage to like a particular a sort of historically invested idea of land. And I know, Lucy, you have worked on the sort of maritime writing in a sense of contemporary writers, and I think a really central element to this book, and you mentioned it yourself, Nicholas, is the chapter on Elaine Nicolanon's writing, and how that comes together with even the work on Sinead Morrissey. Very different, comes from a very different world. And Lucy, I know your wheelhouse, to use again that maritime idea, is in contemporary Irish writing. And I thought maybe you could give us a sense of how you feel this work that Nicholas does, but also that you're doing yourself, thinking from the sea or the ocean or the coast, and those are important distinctions between those, how that actually has an impact on the way we might read and understand contemporary and indeed the future of Irish poetry.
Well, I think that those of us who've been working in the area of Irish literature for a while sometimes feel kind of entrapped in particular questions, particular issues about identity, about territory, which always seem to be rehearsed again and again, and it can be difficult to free yourself from that without ignoring it or failing to engage with it. But it can be very difficult to get a different perspective or a different angle, I suppose, on those questions. And as somebody who works a lot on women's writing, women's poetry in particular, I think there is a necessity to step outside some of those debates and ideas in order to get that new perspective. Like it's an essential, if you like, of retrieving those voices or kind of widening the canon, if you want to call it that, of Irish literature. But I was very struck there just by what Nicholas was saying about the personal underpinning of his work and of this book, which I think really comes through very, very powerfully. But it's also true, I think, of eco-critical perspectives more broadly, is that people are thinking that of course, they're thinking critically. Of course, they're situating those arguments within arguments that have come down to them. But they're also thinking about issues of personal commitment and responsibility and experience, and those are all included in the subjectivity, if you like, of the criticism. So I think that's a very powerful thing. What really struck me, though, most, what I suppose I love most about the book Seatangled, is the way, to go back, Colleen, to your first comment, perhaps, which is the interaction between its engagement with environment and modes of writing. Because very often we see in criticism, particular modes of writing separated out, so you work exclusively on poetry and you don't consider other texts, or you work only on, a major significant writer that has a body of critical work already available. But the beauty of this book is that it moves between, in a very fluid way, and navigates really subtly between different modes of writing, from individual poems, memoir, novels, short stories, journalism, visual arts. And it does it in a really subtle way, in a way that doesn't over-determine the connections between those forms, but allows them to occupy the same space. And that, of course, is in many ways exemplary of the idea of oceanic studies, is the way in which those different layers and elements can combine, that kind of porosity, I suppose, of the boundaries between. And one of the skills, I suppose, that Nicholas is showing in this book that is really key is that range of engagement, from, looking at figures like Yeats and Joyce, to looking at much less well-known figures, both in the mid-century. I'm very interested in mid-century work as well as contemporary work. And that sense in which you can move between those texts, I think, and those forms of writing is really powerful. And in many ways, I was reflecting on the title of the book and the use of the word coast, because it really struck me in reading the book that there's an awful lot in the book that has nothing to do with coasts at all. There is the sense in which the coast moves inland almost, or that the liminal dimensions that we might contemplate in terms of coastal environments can be seen in so many different ways, both geographically and textually in the book. And I thought that was one of the really attractive things about it, in that it didn't limit itself in terms of the kind of territory it was engaging with, the kind of issues it was mapping. I mean, we're accustomed now to think about the place of Ireland within archipelagic studies, for example, and how it kind of frees our sense of how we might view Ireland and Irish historical concerns within a larger framework by thinking of it in this connected way. And people like John Brannigan, for example, have done a lot of work in this area, among others. But I think the subtlety with which Nicholas interprets his own brief, if you like, or extends his own brief, is really powerful. It struck me really particularly in the treatment of weather and how that comes up again and again throughout the book, and especially say in the Heaney chapter, where in that reading of the stranded Loch Beg and the way in which the ideas of rain and mist and things that might alter our visual perspective, our capacity to see, or capacity to bear witness, have a political inflection, but is very subtly handled. I mean, those things are really beautifully done, and I think it's those perspectives that really do open up some new, a new capacity, I suppose, to read Irish literature. A couple of other points just to draw out. One really struck me about the Yeats chapter. And this is about, how we might often think about the coast as a liminal space, or as a way of renegotiating our relationship, particularly with our neighboring island. And it's an interesting kind of throwback to, in fact, to some of the poems I put in my anthology, which is obviously a much earlier period, but there's a lot of accounts of trips across the Irish Sea, and that whole thing of these endless journeys to and fro between England and Ireland, which kind of shadows, I think, quite a bit of the literature. But I was really struck in the case of Yeats, how there's this idea that Yeats can use a coastal environment to think, yes, about his own experience, obviously, as a child and as a young man, moving very often between London and Dublin, and then between Dublin and the West, but also about that sense of the coast as a space which gives us access to another world, in that sort of supernatural sense. So a world of imagination, as well as only a political dynamic, if you like. And in terms of the implications for women poets, and I'll finish on this, because obviously this is something I'm often looking for, is the engagement with the woman, or how a particular mode of criticism can really free up, create space, I suppose, for us to find new ways of engaging with retrieved texts. And I was really struck by a really welcome engagement with the work of K. Arnold Price, for example. It's a brief engagement, but I think it's very telling, that idea that, this is a woman poet who has very little exposure, really, although she's a really interesting writer, and that sense in which she uses the space of the poem as a way of kind of speaking back to more masculine hierarchical structures is very powerful. And the way in which, and we could think of many other women poets and women writers that obviously Nicholas didn't necessarily have space for here, but I think opens up the potential to engage with, or maybe mentions in passing, that ability for the whole vocabulary around the sea and the maritime, particularly around surface and depth, around ideas of submergence that can be at times threatening or challenging, and the way in which women writers have engaged with that, particularly in relation to the representation of the body, and fears about submergence, I think, in a national tradition. And the same could apply to other writers who feel marginalized or perhaps occluded within a tradition. So I think that, for me, one of the most powerful things this book is doing is opening up those perspectives and vocabularies, to later critics coming along.
Yeah, great. It's funny when you talk about fears of submergence. I was actually, a lot of my students are on this call today, and they'll remember that today I just, apropos of nothing, but because I was reading this book, I was gushing about Vona Groart's poem, Pier, which is it's the pier in the small town where I grew up, and the pleasure, the joy of that poem. But you bring up something I think that's really important here, and I sort of mentioned a little bit ago that we're talking in a sense about all kinds of forms of fluidity, and the poem goes from sort of bog water to rain to coast. But that very idea of coast itself, and there's a great quote from John Gillis in the introduction to the book, is John Gillis, I think, Nicholas, about the coast not being on the edge of something, but being itself something. And Harry, Harris, that turns maybe a little bit towards you and your work, because I know that you're interested in the sort of the way that docksides work, and the sort of the forms of sort of economic activity and cultural activity that happen on the dockside. I'm thinking also of Isabel Hofmehr's forthcoming book, the title of which I can't remember, and I should know it. But really on dockside reading. So I'll sort of hand it over to you, but maybe you could think about even what it's like to think from the docks. One of the great chapters of this book, as Lucy pointed out, is that first chapter on Yeats and reading Yeats and his attempt at a novel, John Sherman, as being a form of dockside literature in a sense.
Sure. Well, let me just first thank you and Nicole and Lucy and Candace and Mary for facilitating us, and most of all, Nicholas. Reading Seatangled really felt like sidling up to a dock to me. It felt easy to disburden oneself, to find new provision in these pages. It was pleasant to slosh and bob alongside your thinking, and it struck me that it may prove poignant to occasionally re-embark from this position. So, I as you say, I arrive at Seatangled not as a specialist in Irish literature, but as an admirer of Nicholas and of at least two critical projects with which I find common cause, and the first is the one to which you allude, I think, which is the so-called transnational or global modernist studies as a sort of ecumenical frame for studying the creative arts in an intensive age of empire and industry. And for me, that really does mean thinking about the kind of hard infrastructure of first age of liberal globalization in the late 19th and early 20th century, the dredging of harbors, the construction of modern quaysides, the expansion of massive shipbuilding enterprises, such as one would find in Belfast, the whole kind of apparatus of global connectivity understood in terms of those massive incisions into coastal spaces. And for me, that draws us very quickly away from a liquid or fluid imaginary towards one that's marked equally by interruptions and discurrences of many kinds. And so I've tried to organize the kind of global imagination around those rhythms of disruption rather than rhythms of connection. So I had thought to engage with this book precisely in those terms, and John Sherman, for instance, certainly gripped my attention precisely around that precise set of issues. But as I read, I just became kind of riveted by the set of sort of issues related to the coastal ecology of this book, actually, and they sort of ran away with from those issues, from the issues to which you refer, and brought me towards a sort of the blue humanities side of things. And I did really want to focus in on that for a moment, and because I find so much of interest there. As a way of framing that, I guess I just want to say, no one can fail to have noticed that Nicholas elevates this intriguing compound word for the title of his book, Seatangled, and Lucy referred to the title as well. But I want to put the emphasis on that last word, Seatangled. In the pages of this book, the word occurs frequently enough. It nearly always in participle form, nearly always as the italicized book title itself. Seatangled becomes this kind of evocative verbal alloy for a blue method of cultural study that intricately knots together or nets up these diverse planes of oceanic experience. And one of them certainly is the kind of ideological experience of the coast in various stages of political geography, especially imperial and civil conflict, the attendant forms of work and adventure and nation and transnation that are sort of linked to the portside and dockside imaginaries of places such as Belfast and Dublin and elsewhere. But another perhaps central one is this sort of submerged materialist account of the wet coastal ecology of headlands, of isles and riparian zones and mazes of shallows and bays and strands and tide pools and all of this intertidal phenomena. And I learned this wonderful word from this book that I didn't know. It hasn't really crossed over into American English, and that's the word foreshore, which names that sort of intertidal space. But third in the kind of in the tangle of the sea tangle are these interiorized spaces and aesthetic patterns of literary figuration that Nicholas sort of draws into this matrix. And so the Yeatsian symbol and the Joycean still life and Childer's spy fiction and the scrapbooks of Jack Yates and the lyric of Haney and Elaine Houlinan and the little magazines from the Bell to the Archipelago and all of the rest of it, the site-specific artworks of Dorothy Cross with which he begins, which were great revelations to me as well. All of that, sort of restitches the sea tangle for its own situation. And so I came to think about what it means to be sea tangled in the history of Irish literature is usually to sort of employ one's aesthetic perception to reconfigure the dialectics of the ecotone and the empire, right? The dockside and the intertidal or something, and to somehow be between that habitat and that Capitolocene or something. And that seemed to be a model that helped me to kind of navigate through this book. But it became very notable to me that the word sea tangle appears only once without italics in the entire run of the book, as far as I can see. It is a simple noun submerged very quietly, like a well-positioned clue in a scene in James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which Nicholas quotes, and in which Stephen Dedalus walks along the shallows of Sandymount Strand in Dublin Bay. And I want to quote it really quickly. There was a long rivulet in the Strand, and as he waded slowly up its course, he wondered at the endless drift of seaweed, emerald and black and russet and olive. It moved beneath the current, swaying and turning. The water of the rivulet was dark with endless drift and mirrored the high drifting clouds. The clouds were drifting above him silently, and silently the sea tangle was drifting below him, and the gray, warm air was still, and a new wildlife was singing in his veins. Now, Nicholas gives a wonderful reading of this scene in terms of the sort of development of Dedalus and the ways in which it kind of creates this sort of historical impressionism and joins his whole narrative of Irish literature understood as fluctuating narratives that coastal zones collect like flotsam, as he puts it. But I found that passage curious. Sea tangle, it sounds like a Joycean neologism, but it isn't exactly. The OED, in fact, registers the word sea tangle quite simply amidst compound words for seaweed, sea rack, sea network, a whole sort of list of that vernacular history. Most commonly, sea tangle seems to, if we want to get sort of into the ecology of it, seems to indicate the genus Fucus, or the brown macroalgae or rockweed. And Joyce refers to such algae as sea tangle only once that I can see. But he does oftentimes refer to sea rack and other, other near synonyms. A particular wonderful moment in the portrait, a battle on the shaggy weed-grown rocks, coming home after it, weary stragglers with the stale odors of the foreshore in their nostrils and the rank oils of the sea rack upon their hands and in their hair. And so, sea tangle becomes this drag on Stephen and the nets of, as he tries to flee the nets of nationality and all of those things that we understand about that dynamic, and Nicholas frames that really beautifully. But I just kept sort of the rockweed became my white whale or something. The brown algae became my white whale here. I just couldn't leave that sea tangle alone. And so I started digging around into the Sandymount Strand ecology, and it seemed to me that it was just as likely that it was not actually algae at all, but eelgrasses that maybe were swirling around Daedalus's feet at that moment. Nicholas and I actually recently had the opportunity to join a coastal research group at the University of Virginia where they're doing these wonderful activities, seagrass carbon sequestration through the restoration of the seagrass beds. And so I was really thinking through the materiality of this, and it's not to be pedantic, but to try to note that there is a way in which, you know, Joyce's propensity for his salt-eaten idioms and kennings and linguistic, you know, profusions to become discrepant or discordant with like that, the very ecology that he's describing, if we understood it in terms of like, say, ecosystem services or something, or the kinds of things that that lead us to care deeply about seagrass beds and seaweed beds and so on. And it brought to mind like the kind of another term that I just want to bring in very briefly, which is, you know, all the recent theory about entanglement. Entanglement moving as in the very smart account of the scholar Haji Bakara as something that moves out of sort of quantum physics in the 1990s and the work of Karen Barad, and then becomes a kind of all-purpose, what he calls a crypto-normative metaphor for our you know, collective condition of co-implication and planetarity and so on. And so I wondered in the end, simply, you know, there's a kind of well-taken critique by Bakara there that there's something crypto-normative about starting to think about everything is always entangled, right? But I think of Nicholas's, the sort of materiality of Seatangled in its deep plunge into the like tangle as etymologically linked to the life of these coastal spaces as actually a kind of a caution against worrying about the metaphor of entanglement or something like that, that there's a way in which what you're proposing to a critique of entanglement is a sense of allowing oneself to be immersed in what the long literary genealogy of such experiences are. So for all those things, I'm very grateful for this book. And it's also, I found it freeing to read this and to sort of feel like, well, I'm supposed to speak to my paradigm, but now I'm really interested in this other one that you've brought and to feel that I've been carried over into that. So the questions that I would pose to you, though, sort of out of all of that, have to do with to what extent we should take seriously Joyce's sort of botanical sensitivity to Sandymount Strand. How far into the non-metaphorical dimension of these ecologies should we go? And likewise, to what extent might we read the non-metaphorical account of Seatanglement against those that worry about entanglement getting to be too much of a metaphor. So thanks for
no, thank you, that's brilliant. And I love the attention to vocabulary and the thoughts of connection and association, really, because that's so much of the book. I'll give you brief answers. I think I cannot imagine a time that is not entangled. And in fact, if you think of the colonial history of Ireland and England, Scotland and Wales, that there is no sense of connection that could not be represented at some stage as an entanglement, as even the idea of a net represents a kind of entanglement. And it's been taken to be a kind of an aerial metaphor, but really actually when you read Portrait, and it's very much in the book, one of my favorite parts of Portrait is that idea when he goes to the children's or the schoolboys play in the gymnasium hall and it becomes an arc that begins to float. So I think that there are metaphorical resources and aesthetic contexts in which the idea of lift can come from the idea of entanglement in the sea. And entanglement is not to be captured, but it is perhaps to bear the marks of your previous encumbrances. And those things are not altogether defining. And so I think, I mean, one other part of the book is this idea of a process is ongoing. And maybe that's connected to this idea of observation that Joyce has on the beach. There's really wonderful work by Richard Barlow, which pays very careful attention to the idea of natural history. Also Juliana Edelman and Anna Pilz in a beautiful book with their edition that she's done with Sean Hewitt about 19th century archipelagic literature in Ireland, where they actually write very carefully and well about these things, about the idea of seaweed and its materiality. I suppose I would say in terms of Joyce in that regard, that what you're also seeing is a convergence or a parallel, at least a multimodal experience of observation of the late 19th century, which is both natural, historical, and modernistic, and that those things are there in Joyce, even if the specificity of the attention is not quite precise. Now, there was one thing about Barad, and I'll give over now because I want to hear from Nicole, but there was her wonderful essay about nuclear colonialism on the Marshall Islands that you point me to in the Pacific. And she has a great phrase in that about the idea of the violence integral to the practice of theorizing. And I thought, I mean, she's talking about nuclear testing on atomic islands. But, you know, in a way, the idea of entanglement is also an ethical rebuke to those sets of divisions, which say that there's one island here, no island there, there's a border here, no island, no Ireland there. And I suppose it was inevitable, again, just to go back to the personal that Lucy brought up, that, you know, in the formation that I had socially and intellectually, there was no way that you could not think of things as being entangled because they have never approached any point of resolution. And the only resolution you could have would be to ignore them. So the idea that it's a late 20th century phenomenon to have a process of hyperentanglement, which now becomes a normative metaphor for all kinds of attachment, seems to me to erase the kind of localities that are very much the substance of the book. And there may be different kinds of entanglements and different ways to wear the marks of those attachments.
Yeah, I think actually, Nicholas, at one point you talk about, in many ways, entangled inheritances have been severed. And there's a violence to that work of severing entanglements that in a way you want to put back together through this sort of network of readings that the book puts together. Nicole, I was thinking as Harris was speaking, first of all, I was thinking about brown sludge, Harris thinks, or I don't know what those words were, but Nicole, I was thinking also as Harris was speaking at the very beginning, you know, your work is very much in the area of global modernism, and your next book thinks in many ways about the way that once we turn towards the sea or the ocean, that the very idea of borderland territory begins to dissolve in front of us, and that, you know, even the sort of the paradigms of literary work and how we describe things as in terms of Irish literature or whatever else begin to dissolve in front of us. And I you know, maybe you want to talk a little bit about that sense of, you know, how this work fits into that work that you're doing in sort of the sea and global modernism.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Colleen. And at first, let me also say it's wonderful to be in conversation with you. And I was so happy to have the opportunity to read Seatangled. And just to speak to your point, Colleen, I've drafted some comments about this. And for the sake of time, I think I'll read them so that we can have some conversation, but I'm going to speak to precisely the kinds of issues that Lucy and Harris have already addressed, and some of the questions that Nicholas just spoke to about the idea of entanglement, network, ecology, and materiality and material histories. So the topics that I wanted to talk about today have to do with three main terms that I found running throughout this really ambitious book. So I'll talk about that. And what I want to say first is that I think this is obviously such a rich and wide-ranging book that it offers like numerous directions to pursue for critics who are both within Irish studies, but also outside of it. And I work outside of Irish studies. So Seatangled's hydrocritical approach raises questions about methodologies that are really under debate right now that Harris made reference to. And Harris and I have talked at different times about how we see the seas not simply as these spaces of flow and fluid capital, but also as the sites that so many people in African studies, African-American studies, critical racial studies have taught us to think about them as sites of stasis and interruption, right? So I think these methodologies that are under debate that Seatangled can speak to include those of global modernist studies, as well as post-colonial and world literature studies, and also eco-criticism and critical infrastructure studies. So the book's major themes gesture toward a conversation between Irish literatures and cultures and those from other places, including in my current work and my book that I'm working on, I would say England, the Caribbean, Africa, Germany, and North America, just to name a few. And these interrelated themes are in my, as I've enumerated them, first networks, literary, imperial, colonial, and post-colonial. Second, topographies, especially border topographies, which include the offshore, the littoral, the coast, the port, and their human and non-human inhabitants, plant and animal, laborers and consumers of different kinds and species. And third, hydroelementalism, or the geophysical behaviors of the waters. So one of the most astonishing things about Seatangled, in my view, is the expansive networks it charts across colonial and post-colonial worlds as they manifest within site-specific, although mutable topographies of the coast, the river edge, the island, the archipelago, and others. And by addressing multiple scales, material histories, and elemental and natural ecologies, I think that Nicholas's focus on entanglements of land and water turns our direction to maritime culture's formative effects on works of various traditions and genres, as Lucy was mentioning, from realism and modernism to post-colonial and contemporary poetry and narratives. So the book enables new networks to emerge among genres, often viewed as unconnected or even in conflict and opposition. And this includes even in the kind of domains of world literature studies and modernist studies. So those that are in conflict and opposition are often put so on the basis of historical periods of emergence, by institutional designations, by disciplinary practices, as well as by media aesthetics and formal techniques. And so Nicholas tracks relationships that include and extend beyond direct intertextual citation among literary realisms and modernisms and post-colonial and contemporary migration narratives and poetry and visual arts, as you said, from the end of the 19th century into the 21st centuries. And I just wanted to point to a few of the relationships and exchanges that Seatangled unearths between historical and literary periods and geographies. So in the chapter on the offshore Heaney that breaks through the boundaries of local insularity attributed to Heaney, the quote, laureate of Mossbawn, unquote, we learn that images from the hydrocentric narratives of James Joyce's oeuvre return in the later author's work. So these images help to further challenge the widely accepted, quote, groundedness, unquote, of Heaney's poetics. So too does Joyce's watery imagination recur in a contemporary novel about mutability, but not the Joyce who's the modernist as much as Joyce the realist. And this happens when Nicholas finds John Banville's 2005 Booker Prize winning novel, The Sea, referencing the very images that Nicholas talked about in the beginning of our conversation, that of snow drawn from the dead in The Dubliners, as well as the mood and imagery of the shoreline that has already been discussed, that Stephen walks in A Portrait of an Artist. In a chapter on the collecting practices of the artist Jack Yates, William Butler Yeats' brother, the ephemera of travel, advertising, and other modes of consumption across a far-flung maritime world find home in the striking geometric layouts of Yeats' scrapbooks, a quote, complex assembly of diffuse objects in diverse proximity to each other, the material aftermath of the imperial possession legible in their gaudy refuse, unquote. Pointing to how the long history of seafaring labor and its infrastructure haunt the contemporary global metropolis, Alan reads in Colin McCann's Transatlantic, quote, echoes of the maritime history of the Atlantic, unquote, in the small, everyday sensory experiences of 1998 New York City, such as the, quote, pitch of the elevator cables that recall the rigging of a sailing ship, in Nicholas's estimation. So given its capacity to create networks across historical periods and places, and to manage scales, great and small, minor human affects and perceptions, and major world historic events through its tracking of material cultures of transoceanic capital, and its attention to the vapors and trickles, the flora and fauna in on and off shores and ports of islands from Ireland to Manhattan to Jamaica, I think Seatangled puts to us some new questions about how we address relationships among literature and history, as well as what it might mean to read comparatively in a hydrocritical framework. If reading for the waters in all its variegated elemental states invites a dilated temporal view and encourages us to explore the longue durée of maritime practices on cultural forms, how might it also invite us to rethink our attention to historically specific contexts in which literature emerges and culture and art? So do certain affects, or what Raymond Williams might call structures of feeling, arise from the quotidian micro uses and experiences of water, as well as the macro events involving the hydrosphere at a particular moment and locale? So for example, how might US literature and art composed in the wake of the mishandling of Flint, Michigan's water contamination crisis, or Caribbean literature composed during an age of global warming and its attendant experiences of offshore oil spills, hurricanes, and the explosion of sargassum seaweed, to name another seaweed, or East African fiction created under conditions of drought, and the plundering of fish from coastal waters and the dumping of pollution by former colonial powers there make its way into these works. And I guess what I'm thinking that Seatangled brought up for me was how might we read for water when eco-catastrophes and failed policy regulations are not, in fact, the center point of a work, the defining feature of a plot or its poetics. And I think Nicholas's approach encourages us by moving across scales in this way and thinking about these sort of like, yes, entanglements, but also separations among the natural ecologies, elements, and histories, to approach texts that are not explicitly about these events and that do not and might even appear entirely uninterested in the weather or the racial dynamics of eco-violence, from climate change to water policy and regulation, how we might nevertheless approach them anyway without this kind of explicit centering. So yes, these are some thoughts that the book raised for me.
There is a whole lot here. I want to turn it over to Nicholas maybe to give some thoughts and answers. It's great and really humbling, I think, to hear from all of these perspectives and to learn from all of you and to think about it. You know, in many ways, these are the questions that Seatangled brings up. This is the sort of these are the directions in which the book goes, and asks us to engage with it itself. One thing very quickly, Nicholas, before you speak in answer, and I have so many questions myself, but listen, I'm going to be fired. I should have invited members in the audience a long time ago to write questions in the Q&A function, using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So I really need to just resign here and walk off the screen. We will probably, it's now 7 minutes to the hour, we'll probably take maybe 10 minutes after the hour. So I think there will be time to get to some questions from the audience. Please do feel free to throw in questions and I'll try and catch a couple of them. But if you don't get to it, you can blame me for that. Nicholas, just to hand over to you. I mean, I think in many ways, you know, part of what we're hearing here from Lucy to Harris and to Nicole is, in a sense, the sort of capaciousness and the generosity of the argument of Seatangled. But we could also put that in a different way and say, and I was just thinking about what you called about the violence of theorizing. Because in some ways you're also sort of dealing with, while not sort of directly engaging with, questions of weak theory in many ways that have been at the heart of some discussions in modernism over the last few years, and thinking about how, you know, an attention to these particular scales and these particular forms might ask us to put together texts and objects that might fit only very loosely with each other, and to sort of to hear what emerges out of those. I think the book does that generously. So I'll hand over to you to maybe respond to Nicole and Harris and Lucy, and then we'll get back together and ask a few more questions.
Thank you, and thank you everyone out there for bearing with me. And I have so much to think about, but I will remember to say hello to Nicole's mother, who is out there. So thank you very much. You know, one thought I had, and listen, I just gone back to the idea of entanglement, and actually to Lucy's idea, and general questions about scale. And I've been thinking, you've been saying all these wonderfully brilliant things about what the book made you think of. And I thought many of these things are not things I would ever have thought of. But actually, you know, and to go back to the last book I wrote, when I was writing about Ireland in the period of the Civil War, I tried to do it in a way that was honest to the actual violence that happened, and tried not to manicure it with literary accounts of disrupted societies, of violence. I just, you know, tried to read, and I think that was actually from growing up in the north of Ireland, and I'll get back to the ocean in a minute, and wanting to be honest about what happens in a way. And in a sense, I also, that part of that to me, or maybe transparency is the better word, I have never felt when writing about literary texts, and I've never felt when reading, that I ever wanted to master a text. I never wanted to own it. I never wanted to crack it open. I only wanted to see it. And in a sense, I think John Kerrigan read an early draft of this book, and he'd been very kind to me. And he said to me, what he appreciated was the fact that I didn't explain the books in a way, but I made them visible in a certain way. And I suppose I've begun to think of this kind of work, just you talked about weak theory, and maybe this is a kind of weak theory, I'm not sure, but to make works visible. And the book itself, it doesn't put things in a context, but actually, to go to Nicole's words and this idea of networks, becomes its own set of contexts through which your own reading practice might appreciate or engage with these texts. And maybe what this gives you, I call them points of departure, but maybe actually they're points of exploration, maybe they're points of engagement. But the book, and there is a lovely phrase, again, I thank you for it, Harris, for pointing me to the Barad essay. I think the idea of the constellation, which is a word I often think in my own head when I write, of trying to make these things reflect upon each other. And that in a way, I suppose, I'm a kind of neural guide in the background more than I am a voice telling you what it is that you should think about this text or that text. And I try to do that, though, in a very embedded way, critically, but I also try to manage that through the footnotes. And so in a sense, the footnotes are also this other parallel conversation in the text. And it's not that the two things don't merge or are separate from each other, but they speak to each other in a slightly different way. And, you know, even for myself, just thinking about how to write and the pleasure in writing and wanting to write, and thinking about how to write in a way that allows things to breathe. And that's really why the book is constructed in the way that it is. And I know that can sometimes be a risk for a reader. And I know sometimes readers think, oh, well, that's a jump from that to that. And there's so much. And you're all very kind and you've loved the scale of the book. Some people think that that's a challenge to them, you know, literally as well as intellectually. So they were sort of just thoughts. But I mean, porosity seems important to me. Not being worried about inundation, but thinking carefully. I edited this book so carefully. It went to Fiona Stafford and John Kerrigan before it ever went to the press. It then went to the press, it went to the copy editor. I also had someone who helped me read it again. And then I read it over and over again in that kind of maniacal period of lockdown last year. So in a way, this is also a weirdly wound up lockdown book too. So forgive me if that ever comes apart in any of it. So, you know, it's both a deeply tuned and highly wrought composition at the same time. I'm so grateful, really, that at the same time it kept that sense of openness, and you've responded to that too so kindly. So I appreciate that.
Great. Lucy, can I return to some comments that you made? And in many ways, it's throughout the book. And I love, Nicholas has a great phrase here, W.B. Yeats's performative disloyalty in that early chapter. But in a sense, and you gave us an idea of how the book, you know, frees us from an entrapment in many ways, an entrapment about territory and land. And I wanted to maybe give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about how the maritime view allows us to dissolve boundaries, right? To in a sense, move away from this, you know, and it's also picking up on Nicole's arguments as well, because in many ways, you know, what we're doing here, and part of one of the questions I would put to Nicholas is, does it even make sense to put the word Ireland in here when we're thinking about sort of liquid maritime and the sea? But I'll throw it to Lucy maybe to sort of expand a little bit on how you feel that work is taking place in the book, and how, you know, in a sense, how Irish literature needs to do more of that, I think, is, you know, what we're hearing from you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, that question, and it occurs with a lot of eco-critical debates, that, you know, ideas of national tradition are in many ways redundant when you start thinking in that more connective way, and particularly in oceanic studies, because of that sense of continued change and movement, you know, that it really doesn't make sense in many ways to think nationally. But one of the things that struck me, particularly just as Nicholas was talking there, and because I was thinking about the process of reading, and I read the book twice in a way. I read the first time, I just cherry picked the chapters I was most interested in, and then I read it from beginning to end. And actually, the really interesting thing about it was that you can read it, you don't have to read it in a developmental temporal way, you know, and that actually there are very different resonances and elements that speak across the chapters, you know, in a non-linear way. And that is in many ways a kind of a tribute to this sense in which the book is breaking down those boundaries. I mean, one of the kind of things, I suppose, that has bedeviled Irish studies is that tendency to think always of history and to think of cause and effect of certain things. And in many ways, this book somewhat liberates us from doing that. And instead, you know, to go back to that word constellation as well, instead we can look at these side by side or interacting with one another as chapters or authors, or indeed interacting with things that don't actually appear in the book at all. Like very often, like I'm currently teaching an eco-literature course that's not, I actually don't teach any Irish texts on it. And actually thinking of the resonance between these chapters and some of those other poets is really interesting. So I think in many ways the liberation of the book is to free us from those constraints of cause and effect, and that sense of structure in some ways that we're very often kind of tied to, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what we've heard here from Nicole and from you in particular is the sense of a liberation within the form of the book itself, how it sort of creates these constellations. I might turn to Nicole and Harris for a second, because one of the phrases that returns again and again, especially in the early chapters of the book, is around the question of, and I know, Nicholas, you've worked on this in other forms, obviously in your work on modernism and the Civil War, but also work that you've done on Yeats and Spengler and elsewhere, is that there's a sort of constant refrain of end of empire here, of what the sort of that long withdrawing roar, to draw from Arnold, what that long withdrawing roar of empire looks like from this particular Irish perspective. And I wanted to give, that's a sort of a non-question, but to give maybe Harris and Nicole an opportunity, who are both working in a sense in this 1920s, 1930s, and afterwards, a sense of how this book speaks to a wider world of the possibility of the end of empire, even if actually the British Empire is at its greatest extent in 1928, even as we all know it's sort of falling apart. So maybe Harris, do you want to sort of talk a little bit about that, and Nicole?
Sure, it's a great question. One way that strikes me that one could begin to think about this, you could come into it through the Childers chapter with the premonition of inter-imperial conflict that suggests in terms of a reconfiguration of the maritime powers. The premonition that Britain as the last thalassocracy, as someone put it, is about to meet its rupture somewhere around Heligoland or something, right? But we could reconfigure that in terms of the things that are happening with Alfred Thayer Mahan in the United States, and the emergence of Japan as a maritime power at that moment too. There's a historian named Dirk Bonkers who's done some really good works on the sort of transnational military exchanges of that moment, thinking through the sort of transnational naval knowledge that's being produced along those lines. And so, and then you can carry that through to the overproduction of a commercial shipping world that all of the kind of World War I buildup makes possible, and the sort of surplus problem of the interwar period. And I read much of what you're looking at sort of through that story. And for me, what was particularly interesting is, this is again a caution about being too transoceanic about everything, right? Much of the shipping after World War I becomes coastwise, basically. It's about how quickly can you carve up the world into protectionist rackets, basically, right? The Jones Act in the United States, the insurgent merchant navies in places as far-flung as Argentina and India that are attempting to break different formal and informal imperial dimensions of the British maritime infrastructure, all of this kind of stuff, right? And within that, there are all these laws that are developed to protect, protectionist laws about coastwise trade. And I found it very interesting to think about, well, why doesn't Ireland have anything emerging around there, or does it? Or I don't see it. But what? So that's another question that I have in the end for Nicholas. But I do think that it's really important to actually affirm the kind of national story as a kind of intermediary term that helps us to see what real world of geopolitical relations looks like in that period, and not to be too fluidly moving away from it.
Yeah, to go back to the material in a sense that you were talking about, Nicole.
Yeah, I mean, the work that I feel like the work that I'm doing on this period right now actually has to do with also issues with shipping and trade, as well as the shift from coal to oil and how that manifests itself all over narratives of kind of maritime relations by English, German, Irish writers, Anglo-Irish writers in the 1920s and 30s, in addition to what Harris referenced, which is the different kinds of perceptual shifts that are being introduced under the technologies of war and surveillance, right? So all of these different things make their way into the text. And also, so when Nicholas writes about, one of the things that I was struck is there was a point in the book, and I can't remember exactly what chapter it was, but there's a point in the book in which you say, Nicholas, like, oh, well, this text gives a sense of like the freedom of the seas, or the idea that like there can be movement here, and it ignores the thing. And specifically you say the coffin ship, and I'm writing all about coffin ships and death ships in this period. Harris has also written about this. So I was thinking my emphasis as I approached the book was to really be aware of how industrialization, my emphasis right now is how industrialization and these different kinds of competitions that are not only naval, not only military, but also commercial, for example, between England and Norway, right? Like obsolescence that is writ large all over like fiction of this period and its depiction of ports. That's something that I think, should be in conversation with Irish literature of the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I'll hand over to you, Nicholas, for a second. But in a sense, the conversation that we've just had, and from Lucy to Nicole to Harris, gives us an idea of the breadth of the book, in part because it covers exactly those questions of the industrialization of the shore, of trade, of maritime routes, and then also to in the Heaney chapter to nature and sort of eco poetry, and it moves between what seem to be quite poles that are quite far apart. Nicholas, I'm keeping an eye on time, but I want to give you a chance to speak some more and to sum things up. But there's also a great question here from Rob Shaw Smith that you might want to comment on. It says, is there a book or study that does something similar with Britain or Indonesia or the Philippines, Japan, New Zealand? And it's in a way, it's an invitation to sort of for you to talk about the included global dimensions of the work that you're doing here, even as it concentrates on the island.
Yeah. Well, let me say first of all, thank you all again. But I see there's also a question there from the wonderful and only John Purser, who knows everything about everything, including seaweed. So, John, you're on the Isle of Skye. You're very kind to join in. And Rob from Atlanta, I will come back to your question in one moment. And Nathan, also in Emory, thank you for the kind remark. But I did want to say something actually to Harris and then to Nicole, and then I promise I'll come back and answer the question. At the start you asked me, why did I write this book? I also wrote this book because nobody else had ever written this book, and it just seemed weird to me. And I think it might have been especially weird to me as someone who grew up in Belfast, that there was no coastal or maritime account of Irish literature. There just wasn't one. And why was it not? I mean, it's weird. And I loved Kieran Carson. I went to Queen's as an undergraduate. Kieran was hanging about there. I can remember once giving a talk about Kieran's poetry while he walked up and down like an expectant father outside the door of the lecture hall. He wouldn't come in. But so I had, this sort of that life in the back of my head as well, thinking like, oh, why hasn't nobody written about this? And then, of course, all those other questions that we discussed about how to write such a thing. And to write such a thing, you realize why nobody did it before, because it requires you to ask different questions. And maybe it's actually only a book that could be written now precisely because of the question that Rob asks, which is that this work has begun to be done in other places. And I really feel so fortunate. I don't know if any of you have a chance, but Nick Groom and Joss Smith are great friends of mine. And the book Coastal Works that we did. And then the final one in this triptych that is going to be this reader from Archipelago, the magazine that I've done with my dear friend Fiona Stafford, which is about to be launched, I think, in 2 weeks. That those three books together, I think, show that this is an Irish, an English, a Scottish, a Welsh, a German, a French, a Philippine, a Japanese. Thank you for that, Harris. Really questions of all these dimensions. And I really, for all there are marks of melancholy in the book about not being in the sea, but actually, there's so much of this work also couldn't be done, and there were complicated reasons for this without working in the American Academy. And maybe the freedom that you also read in the book is also a freedom of being able to breathe out a little bit here and of trying different kinds of things. And I think that that's, you know, part there in the mix. And it's a complicated relationship, naturally, and has its very complex histories, but I think that that is also part of the texture of all of these conversations. But if I was to leave any of you, I mean, if you were to, I'm just thinking about this question of coasts, of Harris, you say about protectionism, about the history of the mercantile, but also thinking about that idea of transcendence, of playing with literary form, of those sense of networks that you have, Nicole. And then even Lucy, in a very attentive way, thinking about the lives and presences of others. I mean, without reading my book, go and read Kieran Carson's The Star Factory. I mean, that to me is the kind of the presiding narrative at the middle of this. I think I really was most pleased with the way the Heaney chapter worked out, because I felt like I really found something in Heaney that spoke to me. With that Kieran Carson book, along with Elena Quillanon's work, I think if any of you were looking for a book to read that described what this future antiquity might look like, that to me is a kind of a global book of the sea, a book about Belfast. And I've also, over the years, my wife is from Cork, and I've had great pleasure going there. And the connection I have found in the stories between Cork as a maritime city and Belfast as a maritime city seem to me to far exceed all the differences that you imagine they should have, being North and South, Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland. And again, so that maritime, it's not a question of bringing people back together again necessarily, but perhaps seeing equivalences, shared conditions. And surely maybe those are the connections for solidarity that we would hope for, that might begin to shape some different kind of narrative about our collective future.
Nicholas, it's an amazing sort of summing up of the conversation that we've had today. As I said, we're going to be here for the next 3 hours. You're welcome to stay now, and we can't do that, but there's so much more to talk about. This is a really rich book, and I'm also just delighted to be here with Lucy, with Nicole, with Harris, and with Nicholas. Any of you who know my own work will know that, you know, this is it is adjacent to my work, and it's a real pleasure to hear these scholars I admire and know and have taken great pleasure in reading their work, and to hear us all come together. It's been a delight. So thank you to all of you who are still here with us. It's been lovely to have you. Nicholas, do you want to jump in and say something?
I just want to say one more thing, and yeah. I think to thank also what's important is Jacqueline Norton at OUP, who just had great faith in me and allowed the book to be as it was. So again, and thank you again to all of you.
Jacqueline Norton from Oxford University Press, who, you know, as you said, allowed the book to be what it is. Essentially. So thanks to all of you. Watch out on our website for more programming coming up unrelated to this, although we will have conversations in the spring on Yeats, Joyce, and India. We'll talk, I think, with, I'm hoping, fingers crossed, I think we'll be talking to Lauren Arrington about her work on the Poets of Rapallo. So a little bit too much modernism. That's my fault, because that's my thing. So we'll talk about a lot more as well. But coming up, we'll have a conversation on Northern Ireland, bringing together historians, cultural historians, young activists, some politicians, and a conversation on the sort of the policy world of the transatlantic, the policy of the transatlantic world. So watch out for those. It's been a pleasure to have you with us today. And again, Lucy, Nicole, Harris, and especially Nicholas, for bringing this book to us. Thank you so much, and I will see you all online, or indeed watch out for this in person at some point shortly. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.